Right, so we're at part 8 in this series of how to build your first NANOREEF aquarium. Building up true reef keeping knowledge takes years. You can become reasonably competent within a few months, providing you've got the right sort of information at your disposal. But true in-depth knowledge takes decades to acquire. And for beginners, the people that this particular channel is aimed at, if you're going to be successful, I think it's of paramount importance that you get your information from a good source. Now, this is going to sound a little bit paradoxical because I'm running this channel on the internet, but the first bit of advice I'm going to give you is avoid the internet for information. On the online forums, the reef keeping forums, the marine fish keeping forums, and on YouTube, it's very easy for anybody to profess to the world that they're an expert in reef keeping. I stopped frequenting online forums 20 years ago simply because of the appalling advice that's routinely given out by people who think they're an expert because they've had a reef tank for 4 months or 6 months or a year. And it's the same here on YouTube. You'll see channels giving out advice. Yet if you look through the history of the channel, they never seem to have a tank up and running for much more than a year before the stripping down and upgrading, or the tank develops a leak, or 101 other reasons why they've got to start again. Reasons which, of course, are never their fault. There is no substitute for good quality books on the subject. I know they are expensive, and in these days of social media they can also be a little bit more difficult to come by than they used to be. But 99% of them are written by fully qualified authors, people that are respected by the reef keeping world as a whole, and their books will contain information that you can rely on to give you a sound basis of knowledge in this hobby. The information given in these books is not dependent on the latest craze, the latest fashion, or, as is so often the case with YouTube, the latest products that a particular manufacturer or distributor is trying to sell. Now, in the last episode, episode 7, we got the tank up and running. And I did say that in this episode we're going to be looking at putting some fish in, but on reflection, after I'd uploaded that video, it struck me that I was jumping the gun a little bit, because the first thing you actually need to do is find a reputable aquatic store or local fish shop to get your stock from. And that in itself these days can be a minefield. About 20 years ago, with the advent of live rock being more readily available to hobbyists, there was a massive explosion in the reef keeping hobby. And along with that explosion of interest came an explosion in the frequency of new marine keeping shops opening up. From the end of the 1970s right through until about 2000, 2001, in my hometown there was one long-term marine fish supplier that had continued to do a good trade for decades. And then very suddenly, by about 2005, that shop had been joined by about another 5 retail outlets. People, often just hobbyists themselves, quick to try and capitalise on the new popularity of reef keeping. Now, in essence, there's nothing wrong with that, because it's nice to have the choice to be able to go to different retailers. But unfortunately, what came along with this new sort of proliferation of marine shops was a string of badly run, often dirty aquatic shops selling poor quality, often ill and diseased fish, and manned by staff that barely had enough knowledge to keep their own tank going, let alone a retail outlet. Now, experienced reef keepers would soon learn to stay clear of these types of shop, but unfortunately there are an endless supply of newcomers to the hobby that know no better and were unable to spot the warning signs until it was too late. This type of aquatics retailer is still very much on the go, and the trade is aimed very much at the newcomer, because really the name of the game for these people is to rip as much profit as they possibly can out of a hobbyist before you either bankrupt him and he decides not to continue with the hobby, or he learns that you don't know what you're doing and he starts going elsewhere. The first thing that you should do when you enter any new aquatics centre is just consider the cleanliness of the place. Now, you do have to allow a reasonable amount of leeway because marine keeping, in essence, is quite a dirty hobby. It's impossible to keep any such retail outlet scrupulously, clinically clean. The first thing that you should do is consider the smell when you enter the premises. There is one particular aquatic centre that I'm aware of that as soon as you walk through the door, you're met by a nauseating, sickening smell of putrefaction. A sort of pungent smell of rotting fish and fish food. This is a major red flag that something is wrong somewhere. It's either just a lack of a reasonable level of housekeeping, which in itself is a red flag, or there's something seriously wrong with some of the aquatic systems. And another feature of this particular aquatic store is that whenever you walk in, all the staff are at the till, crowded round a laptop, or looking at the phones instead of cleaning. I only visited that particular shop twice. I gave them the benefit of the doubt the first time. The second time I never went back again. And it is actually a part of a large local chain. A sort of a warm, humid, ocean type smell is quite understandable in aquatic centre. There's large volumes of warm seawater circulating about the place. That's to be expected, but there shouldn't be any bad smells. None of these retail outlets seem to be curing live rot these days, so there's no excuse for it. Secondly, cleanliness of the actual stock tanks that the fish are in. Algae growth on the glass and a build-up of detritus in the bottom of the tanks. Even in a small aquatic centre, cleaning of tanks is a full-time job. And when I managed an aquatic centre, my motto was to all staff, if you're not doing anything, clean tanks. Because in heavily stocked, well-fed stock tanks, algae is a major problem. Now again, don't expect the stock tanks to be clinically clean. That is impossible. Even in a well-maintained system, there's always going to be a slight bit of algae growth on the glass, especially in the corners of the tanks. And there may be remnants of uneaten food from the last couple of days' meals, but if there's a big build-up on the floor of the tank, it's not been looked after properly. And certainly, if you're having trouble seeing the fish through the glass, the manager of that shop is not doing his job properly. The next thing to do is look through the water, up at the surface of the water, up at the top of the tank. It should be bright and glassy like a mirror. If there's a brown or brown and green film forming there, there's a problem with the system. Again, down to maintenance or lack of it. Either someone's not been keeping an eye on the protein skimmers, or no one's been checking the flow into the individual stock tanks. Either way, again, someone's not doing the job properly. These are the sort of conditions that will allow a fish to become stressed, ill, conditions that are likely to lower its immune response and leave it susceptible to diseases. You do not want to be buying expensive marine fish from a tank that looks like that. Then take a look at the actual fish themselves. They should be swimming around doing the kinds of things that fish do. Foraging around, looking for food, and behaving relatively normally. Study the actual fish themselves. You're looking for reasonably well-rounded, almost plump fish. They shouldn't have pinched stomachs. That's an indication that they either are not feeding or they're not being fed. Study the fins on the fish. They should all be free of tears and bites. The fish themselves should be coloured up properly and the skin should be flawless. No damage to scales or skin. Study some books and get to know what the two major marine fish diseases look like. And check for this in the tanks that you're looking at. White spot or cryptocarian irritans is indicated by very distinct pinhead size white spots, which is usually more visible on fins and tails. And amylodinium or marine velvet which again can be spotted by less distinct white spots, but more often by an even covering of thick mucus on the fish's body and eyes, giving a sort of a milky appearance to its eyes. Both of these diseases are fish killers, and they will wipe a retail system or a home aquarium out within the space of days. Any evidence of this in an aquatic centre's stock tanks, walk out immediately. Now, different retail outlets have different forms of filtration. Some run their entire showroom on a centralised system, and some will have individual banks of say 6 or 9 tanks that are run on their own individual sort of centralised filtration system. Either way, if there is either of these two diseases in one of those fish, the chances are it's infecting the entire system that is serving that tank. Another indication, if they're trying to hide disease in the systems, it may be something stuck over the front of several tanks, you know, cardboard or plastic, or the lights turned out. Be suspicious whenever you see that. Now, it used to be considered sensible to keep a prophylactic amount of copper running in these systems to basically kill off the parasite that causes these diseases during its free-floating stage. Copper, admittedly, is a bit of a double-edged sword because it is also immunosuppressive. The trend these days in retail systems seems to be to run without copper and rely on UV sterilisation in the filtration system. UV sterilisation isn't 100% effective, although, you know, I am prepared to concede that modern up-to-date UV sterilisers may be better at it than they used to be. Either way, on touring a lot of my local aquatic stores, I am seeing quite a high incidence of these two diseases. It's quite easy to tell if a shop is not running copper because quite often they will also keep invertebrates in the tanks with the fish. Snails, shrimps, hermit crabs, etc. Copper is extremely poisonous to these creatures, that's why it's used for killing parasites off. So if they are mixing invertebrates in the same system as the fish, you can be sure that they're not using copper. In such cases, be extra alert regarding diseases. Now, when it comes to corals and anemones, that kind of thing, they're generally housed in completely different systems with very shallow tanks. Again, these systems can be very susceptible to neglect. Again, tank maintenance and cleaning should be just as fastidious as it is with the marine fish tanks. All corals should be fully open with the polyps extended. There shouldn't be any coral species sitting there rotting and falling apart, and I do often see that. The tank should not be choked up with different types of seaweed or filamentous algae. Again, I often see that. And incidents of aptasia and coral-eating nudibranchs are higher than I have ever seen them in over 30 years. Now, this basically comes down to the fact that a lot of corals are cultivated now rather than wild caught. There's nothing wrong with fragging or coral cultivation. You know, I applaud it and I welcome it. It is something that we should be doing. It is regarded as being something of a black art, but as you will discover if you get into the hobby properly, cultivating corals is easy. Especially the run-of-the-mill stuff that you tend to see regularly in the shops. The principles are very similar to just taking cuttings from a plant and growing a new plant. But like a lot of things in the marine keeping hobby, there seems to be some mysticism attached to it. Prices are very high for cultivated or fragged corals. Unfortunately, the standards of husbandry that go with them is not high. I'm afraid I don't have any pictures to see you because I don't have these infestations in my aquarium, but familiarise yourself with what a mangiano or an aptasia looks like. They're very distinctive. And also familiarise yourself with what a nuisance nudibranch may look like. There are plenty of resources online that show identification pictures, and most decent books will feature a section on them. These are the creatures that most shops will warn you against when buying live rock. They will present these as a reason why you shouldn't use live rock. Unfortunately, they don't come in on the live rock. They won't generally survive the curing process. They come in on the coral specimens. At Christmas, I had a young lady lecturing me about why we don't use live rock anymore and the dangers of live rock with Aptasia and nudibranchs and other unwanted hitchhikers. And I have to admit, I sort of switched off while she was giving me this lecture, and at the same time I was looking over her shoulder into one of her coral tanks, and I counted 15 well-grown, very mature Aptasia growing in her coral tank. The last thing you want to be doing is spending an exorbitant amount of money on a coral specimen and then 2 days later having to come back and spending another £15 on some sort of treatment to rid yourself of the pests that came with that specimen. Familiarise yourself with what these creatures look like, and if you see them in the stock tanks at your local shop, find another shop to go to. Unfortunately, these kind of shops do rely on a newcomer's ignorance to these things, and the problem is currently bigger than I've ever seen it in the trade. Do the research yourself, find out what to be looking out for, and make sure that you're well armed before you walk into a shop. While you're waiting for your tank to cycle, do a tour of all your local shops. Find one that is right for you. Now finally, and this isn't a deal breaker for me, but again it could be a problem for the novice, and that is the knowledge of staff. Just like we see online on the forums or on YouTube, you will often find yourself confronted by a shop assistant who professes to know everything there is to know about marine keeping, reef keeping, but in actual fact knows very little. Again, if you can, do a tour of these retail outlets and find one with knowledgeable staff. But be warned, they are in short supply. Generally speaking, these aquatic centres pay minimum wage only, or at least they do in the UK. And minimum wage is unlikely to attract an experienced, well-read aquarist. And this is why you should do your own research and reading prior to going in. If you're in any doubt, you're unsure about something that you've been told, maybe it contradicts what I've said or what certain other resources have said, don't buy anything, go home, do some reading and find out what the facts are. Believe me, over the years I've been confronted with some real prima donnas in these shops whose knowledge wouldn't fill the back of a postage stamp. As a newcomer to this hobby, knowledge is power, and I can't emphasise enough how important doing your own research is. Now, I know this video may sound a little bit negative, but there are some really good aquatic stores out there. Shops that want you to succeed so you'll keep coming back and spending money with them for years, rather than shops that just want to rip a quick profit out of you before you disappear. They are there, it just may require a little bit of researching to find the right aquatic centre. And those few weeks while your tank is cycling are the best time to do this. Right before I go, I'd like to shout out a thank you to Lewis from Octopus 8 Aquatics for allowing me to come into his shop and do some filming while he was fitting his new marine retail extension. Right, once again, thank you so much for watching this video. I really do appreciate your time. We're past the 1,000 subscriber mark already. That's come around really quickly. I hope you've enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you have, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel, and if you do subscribe, be sure to hit the notification bell so that you can be informed whenever I upload a new video. I will of course be back next week, so until then, stay safe and I'll see you soon.